Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Halftime Talk feature interview series. I'm delighted today to be joined by Michal Meidan, who is head of Chinese research program at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Michal, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me back.
Great to have you. Well, lots to catch up on, and we will obviously be focusing on China in general, but of course that has a lot of tentacles that reach both domestically and west and east. So look forward to having your insights on that. I mean, let's start by talking about China's economic outlook first of all. And from an energy markets point of view, those stakeholders have been adjusting finally this year to this sort of new normal of a new GDP growth number that's been settling in for a year or two. China's sort of changing, I suppose, energy dynamic domestically as well in terms of how it's consuming and powering what it needs. So, from an economic outlook point of view, give us your take on where you think the Chinese economy is going in 2025 from a performance point of view, and then we'll delve into the mechanics a bit more.
Obviously, there's a lot we still don't know about 2025 because of President-elect Trump. I think the Chinese have been putting in measures to stimulate the economy, although I would caution about using the word stimulate. I think they're looking to stabilize more than re-inject massive growth. The real estate sector, which has really been the driver of a lot of industrial activity in China, is still weak. And again, there the idea is to really stabilize it. I have to keep using that word. The other element that they've done so far is inject liquidity into the market. And the focus there is on ensuring that local government debt doesn't become a deeper problem, because what's been happening is that local governments that need to pay off debt can't pay salaries, they can't pay construction workers. So really there's a whole debt swap that's going on to give them a bit of a lease on life and to ensure that activity can happen. So it's not a big boost, but the point is that they've also been doing that in a very gradual manner, because now that Trump has been reelected, they expect a round of tariffs to come and they need to keep some powder dry for 2025. So overall, I think when we're seeing already signs that the economy is stabilizing, that sort of the weakness has bottomed out, but they will be very measured in what they do and try to make sure that it doesn't sort of tank because of the effect of trade. The economy has become extremely reliant on exports over the past sort of year or two. So that's where they need to strike the balance. So far, they're doing an okay job, but again, there's a huge amount of uncertainty.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned tariffs. Obviously, that is a big part of China's current consideration now, what's to come. If you take Trump at his word, there's big tariffs to come and be slapped on there. I mean, he's being criticized domestically for how that might impact American manufacturers and importers of Chinese goods, obviously, from an inflationary point of view. But China, from what you're saying, seems to be taking Trump at his word. How much of that powder have they kept on reserve? And what do you think could happen? I mean, the scenarios of if Trump does what he's saying, there will be an impact on China. Will it retaliate? How can it retaliate? Again, how will it manage that?
And I think there's a lot that we need to see who's going to be on his team. There's a lot of talk about Lighthizer and all of those, so how they actually implement it. I think the other question in a lot of people's mind is are tariffs an opening shot for a negotiation? Or is the mindset going to be, there's no discussion here. What we want is really to tackle a formidable enemy. But notwithstanding that, I agree with what you were alluding to. The Chinese are much better prepared this time in for Trump. And they have, I guess, two tools that they used last time, which was retaliatory tariffs. Although those were painful, and they were painful for the Chinese economy as well. Last time they also devalued the currency, which they're less likely to do this time. They're not in as good a position to do that.
No, it's weakened against the dollar, obviously, already. Yeah.
Yes, weakened against the dollar, and they have a vision of financial stability and how they want to portray themselves in both in the world. But the innovative tools are already, we heard Xi Jinping in his tour at APEC and at the G20 saying that they would cut tariffs for developing economies unilaterally. Now, that doesn't give a massive bump on growth, but symbolically, it's a nice touch. And there's already discussions, and they might do some of those things with Europe and with other advanced economies as well, just to take some of the pain off. They have export controls that they didn't have last time, that they're using on a number of critical minerals or metals in industries where they lead pretty dramatically. And there's also domestic legislation, entity lists, sort of the kind of retaliatory measures that they can take on US industry. Now, none of this means that it doesn't hurt the economy, but there are sort of, I guess, bargaining tools or negotiating cards that they can come to the table with and say, do you really want to do this? But if Trump really does it, and I think there is an assumption that it won't be 60%, we don't know, then there will be pain. But you know, and they've been hardening the economy for this for a long time. They've been
and I mean, the minerals negotiating point is a big one, isn't it? They own a lot domestically in Africa, so that would be a big one, and I'm sure they'll have a few tools to sort of retaliate if needed or negotiate, as you said. I mean, one point, while we're still on the tariff story, you know, in the last year we saw America and Europe, you know, slap on the tariffs on the EVs. Just to talk about the EV industry, China's EV industry is booming domestically. Its cars that are getting out and being exported are being complemented as very price competitive and, you know, good specimens, if you like. Where did that all end? Where is that all ending, do you think, this year? Would China be looking for a reprieve on that, you know, and to be able to sort of export more of that very innovative product that's becoming part of its, you know, big part of its sort of economic manufacturing agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. You're spot on. The what's called the new three industries, which are EVs, batteries, and solar panels, have really been drivers of economic activity and offsetting some of the weakness in the real estate sector. They are in pretty advanced negotiations with the EU. The EU is the critical markets because exports to the US have been pretty much blocked off already. So that's not an export market. The EU is critical. And then there are emerging economies. Now, they don't have the buying power that advanced economies do have, but already we're seeing a lot of sales going to other markets. There will be a consolidation, I think, in China, both in EVs and solar panels. Their margins are very weak in China because of excess capacity, but sales will continue. I think some studies have shown that even with 30 or even 45% tariffs in Europe, they're still competitive. So it ends up being more costly for the end user, but they can still compete on price.
Okay, and I mean, what about, we're talking about mobility, LNG use, because I know that there's been, you know, again, a ramp up of the truck industry, you know, switching to LNG. Some people have been a bit cynical about the numbers that, you know, again, data out of China always being sort of scrutinized a little bit extra. But is that, do you think, making as much of an impact as the Chinese are telling us in terms of the LNG power, if you like? And you know, that obviously is a very positive thing for exporters of LNG who are sending stuff to China.
It's absolutely been a big story this year, the fuel switching from diesel to LNG. It's taken probably 10% of diesel demand off the market, so roughly 400,000 barrels a day of diesel consumption, which is pretty big. How much gas it's added is a slightly more complex question, and there have been numbers of 10 to 15 BCM of LNG floating around, which feels a bit big. I mean, China's incremental demand of gas this year has been to date 30 BCM, which is massive. I don't think that a third of that has been in diesel to LNG switching, but it's certainly given a boost to the market. We've seen sales of LNG trucks surge sort of month on month, but I would caution there that even though they are increasing rapidly, LNG trucks are maybe 1/5 of the fleet. And a lot of trucks are actually dual use. They've sort of put in dual engines and they can switch back and forth from diesel to LNG. So when price dynamics change, and obviously we're seeing LNG prices go up as Europe needs more, as the winter is getting colder, they could actually switch back to diesel. So this isn't necessarily diesel demand destruction or LNG creation that we count on. And if you think about what we were just talking about, the EV sector and batteries, I think over time, I mean, clearly the Chinese government has policies in place to move away from diesel in transport. But over time, that move could actually be to electrification rather than LNG. So LNG is a short-term gain rather than a structural shift.
Okay, with the flexibility to switch back to diesel, which is very clever, obviously, and again, from a security point of view. Let's talk a little bit about oil, that good old-fashioned commodity. Obviously, China's oil consumption this year has dropped from last year. Having had a bit of a sort of blip up post-COVID, etc. But again, the whole, can OPEC rely on Chinese demand? Can the world really rely on China's oil demand to keep that energy price propped up? That's been a big question this year. And obviously there's vulnerability there with the bearish market as far as oil producers are concerned. Again, outlook for China's oil demand, has it, I mean, would you see that its crude oil demand will peak in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time? We don't know, but the trend line, where is that going? And what does that mean for, major sort of oil producers like Saudi Arabia, like Russia, obviously a country from which China's taken quite a bit of oil in the last year or two?
I think the short answer is no. We can't trust on China's growth to continue. We have seen, as you've mentioned, we've had 6 months of a fall in product demand in China, and that's mainly led by gasoline and diesel. Whereas I was just saying that diesel, there's a switch sort of back and forth that happens. In gasoline, the structural change is there. I mean, electric vehicles now account for over 50% of sales every month. It's still 10% of the fleet. So let's not confuse sales with the fleet. But EVs are now cheaper than ICE vehicles. They're extremely appealing in China as well. There's charging infrastructure. They are very sophisticated cars. They're being built, a bit like phones. They're very snazzy, and there are lots of really nice designs out there. So the EV trend is here to stay, and gasoline demand has probably peaked or is close to a peak. I think the question then is how rapidly does it fall? And perhaps some of the estimates, or at least some of the forecasts from OPEC, might be overly bullish on gasoline demand in China. So we're coming to a point where overall product demand is probably about to stagnate, even if we get half a percentage point increase over the next 1 or 2 years. The only bright spot for crude is chemicals. Chemicals are still growing and still growing pretty rapidly. But overall, sort of, I think what we're going to see is China. I mean, it's still the biggest importer of crude, even though it's declining. I think when you look at forecasts, even out to another 20 years, in lots of different scenarios, it remains the world's largest crude importer, even as volumes go down. So it's still going to be an important market. But I think we're heading into, again, slower sales of crude into China. For now, slightly more product exports out of China, but gradually a shift into chemicals, and that's going to be the big story.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of money going into that. And also, countries like Saudi Arabia pouring a lot of money into obviously petchem investments. I mean, just moving a little bit away from China, but it's relevant, obviously, because it's all about where the demand comes from. But let's go to oil supply and talk a bit about OPEC Plus for what it's worth, and then non-OPEC oil. We've had, again, the last 6 months has been a story of, there's a glut of oil on, in the short term supply, there's low demand, there's plenty of supply. CapEx in long-term supply has been slow, but certainly seems to be now coming back. Lots of offshore drilling plans also in the US, Gulf of Mexico. From an OPEC point of view, do you think they should be getting more nervous in terms of their market share going forward, or can they hold their 30% steady and continue to, for example, give up market share for the sake of price? I mean, again, they have a decision to make next month. Where would you put your money on that OPEC's going to go with its volumes?
I mean, I can say from sort of the inbound perspective that it is going to be harder for OPEC to place those volumes in China. I mean, the demand structurally just isn't there anymore. Again, except for chemicals, as we've just discussed. Even the stockpiles are pretty full. So there's a little bit more that they can do in their refineries starting up. There's a whole sort of rejig of the refining complex in China. But the other thing that OPEC faces is competition from sanctioned crudes, and that whole market that is a bit harder to distinguish, to understand the price dynamics. Iran has been a massive exporter to China. And so the OPEC countries, well, Saudi Arabia has been competing quite aggressively with Iran and Russia and Venezuela and losing in that competition. Tighter sanctions might change it, but also I think the domestic dynamics in the Chinese refining sector will change it, which will benefit, I guess, the Saudi and OPEC producers, non-Iran OPEC producers. But Russia will still be another key supplier to China. And then there's a question of tariffs or Trump, and if there's another trade deal, will we see more US oil flow to China? Right now, the trend has been different. In the kind of 2018, 2019, after the phase one trade deal, we saw an increase in US oil to China because China had to buy more. But since then, it's fallen, and China's actually diversified its imports. But a trade deal, again, could alter those dynamics.
Absolutely. I mean, a trade deal coupled with, let's say, Trump getting harsher on Iran, could make China sort of accept, okay, well, we'll stop taking Iranian oil, we'll take more of yours. I mean, on that point of Trump again and the Iranian sanctions on Iran, a lot of people again have said, yes, he may, on day one say, okay, boom, we're going to increase sanctions on the Iranian economy, on energy, on other things. But that actually won't change China's it can't be effective, let's say, because actually Iranian oil is just going to China, and it's very much a bilateral sort of agreement there, and that will continue regardless of what actually happens in the sort of oversight of sanctions on Iran. Would you concur with that? It would need China's 100% cooperation for sanctions on Iran's exports to have any impact?
I would broadly agree. I mean, I don't think that the Chinese government is actively encouraging imports of Iranian oil. I think it's turning a blind eye. Most of the oil is going into the Shandong independents. So the teapot refiners are the biggest bargain hunters. The reason the government is turning a blind eye is because the economy is weak. And by buying discounted crudes, that's creating economic activity in Shandong. But if there is tighter enforcement, then I think the government will crack down a little bit. There's still a lot that you just can't, we've talked about Shandong independence for years and years and years and how good they are at I guess, very creative tax practices. Some crude will still go to China because a lot of these plants don't have any exposure in the US or any exposure to, US financial institutions. And so they will still import. I think, again, if there's a deal, if there's an agreement and the Chinese government is willing to crack down and enforce things more stringently, then we will see Iranian volumes reduced, but probably not to zero. But as I was mentioning earlier, I think it's the domestic dynamics that will prevail, sort of a weaker demand, new refineries that are more sophisticated, that maybe have more competitively priced alternative fuels will give the teapots less opportunity and incentive to buy Iranian oil. But I think we have to be a bit careful about sort of how much the Chinese government is actively encouraging this and doing this.
Yeah. I mean, the other part of it is related to that. As you said, its focus now is domestic. It's getting its domestic economy house in order. It's been anyway transitioning its economy to, I mean, it's still obviously manufacturing and exporting, but trying to move to a service, a greener economy, etc. With that focus now that Xi Jinping has, for obvious reasons, how is that impacting China's stand on the international stage, putting aside its direct relations with the US, but South China Sea, its involvement perhaps behind the scenes in the whole Middle East political equation, as a silent, if you like, negotiator? I mean, would you say China's letting go of that proactive role internationally and has to really focus on its domestic, at least its regional relations?
I think China's always been very sort of obviously domestically focused, as every government is, right? You want to make sure that things are stable at home, and a lot of the other things that it does go through a domestic prism. And I think that hasn't changed. And obviously, the kind of near abroad is still the core of China's interests. But even as it imports less oil and not less gas, I mean, it's still going to be reliant on imported gas for a while to come. you mentioned earlier, right, the materials and the minerals from Africa and the exports. Yes, it's trying to rejig its economy, but it's still very export reliant and export dependent. So it's a change of products, it's a change of minerals and materials, but China still needs global markets to be open.
Mm.
And so it's still extremely active. Now, how does it choose to position itself geopolitically has always been slightly different to how the US chooses to use influence and power. But it still has a huge amount of interest sort of around the world. Right now, most of those interests are actually just opposing the US or calling out Western hypocrisy in many countries, but it's still sort of playing that very international game, um, and has a view or a desire to maintain a role for itself globally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one part of the global equation, it is obviously linked into is the BRICS body, which is what it is at the moment. But again, a lot of talk this year about new membership, expanding that, the global South, uh, literally gaining ground in every sense. Is China a country within BRICS that it would be open to more members? Is that what you hear when you're talking to those in the know? You know, some members perhaps are more open than the others. Would you see that as something we'll see kind of progress next year?
I mean, I think that they've already increased the membership quite a bit, and that's where exactly the internal dynamics, and especially between China and Russia, can
Yeah.
get a bit fraught about, who do you admit into BRICS. But I think China is very much willing to show that it can create alternative international institutions. And the point is not necessarily to undermine the UN or to undermine existing institutions, but where they are flawed or seen to be as not acting in favor of emerging economies, then to show that there are alternatives, there are alternative fora. Now, is there a vision articulated for those? Is there a clear mission statement? Probably not. I mean, it's a bit blurry, but it helps, right? It helps. And if we think about, I think what China has been preparing for is sort of this fortress China or sanction proofing its economy, not because it's planning to invade Taiwan, I don't think, but because the world is looking increasingly fraught and the prospect of tariffs and sanctions and blockades are looking increasingly likely. In that kind of a world, China wants to make it very difficult for third countries to choose between itself and the US. And I think that's the kind of prism that we should be looking at the BRICS and other institutions. It is just tying lots of other countries
Yeah.
to China so that decoupling becomes effectively impossible. And any choice, again, between the US and China is just not one that other countries are willing to make.
Okay, well, Michal, Meidan, thanks so much for joining us today on Halftime Talk. It's been great to get your perspective on the latest in Chinese thinking and operations on the ground. Great to have you with us.
Thank you very much.